The 1990s in South Texas were a time of open roads, uncharted adventures, and the kind of stories that only the desert could tell. My friends and I, a group of 5, had planned a camping trip near the Rio Grande. We were young, restless, and drawn to the rugged beauty of the desert. The land stretched endlessly, a canvas of red sand and prickly cacti under a sky that felt bigger than the world itself. We reached our chosen campsite after a long drive on a dirt road that seemed to disappear into nothing. The area was remote, no other cars, no other people, just us and the wilderness. It was perfect, or so we thought. The first 2 days passed peacefully. We explored dry creek beds, admired the endless horizon, and spent nights by the fire sharing stories under the clearest sky we'd ever seen. But on the 3rd day, everything changed. We were hiking late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the desert. Sarah, always the most curious in our group, noticed something unusual sticking out of the sand near an old mesquite tree. She stopped abruptly and pointed. "What's that?" she asked. We gathered around to see a weathered, rusted cooler partially buried in the sand. Its lid was slightly ajar, and a sense of unease immediately settled over us. "Do we open it?" Jake asked, glancing around nervously. Sarah, without hesitation, pried it open. The lid creaked loudly, as if protesting. Inside was a collection of items that didn't belong together. Stacks of cash, bloody clothing, and a folded map. The cash was old, stained with something dark. The clothing was stiff and dried, with a metallic odor that turned my stomach. The map, though, was the most unsettling. It was hand-drawn, crude symbols marking various locations. Some were circled, others crossed out, and a few were marked with crude skulls. "This feels wrong," I muttered, stepping back. Jake examined the map, his face pale. "It looks like this area," he said, pointing to the skulls. "These marks, they're near our campsite." We argued about what to do. Sarah wanted to keep the map, convinced it was part of some treasure-hunting prank. I wanted nothing to do with it, feeling like we were intruding on something dangerous. In the end, we decided to leave the cooler exactly where we found it and head back to camp. But the walk back felt different. The desert, usually alive with the sounds of wind and wildlife, was eerily silent. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced we were being followed, but saw nothing. That night, the unease lingered. As we sat around the campfire, the usual laughter and jokes were absent. Every sound, a rustle of leaves, the crackle of the fire, made us jump. Around midnight, the distant hum of an engine broke the silence. We froze, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, closer. A set of headlights appeared on the horizon, cutting through the darkness. A black pickup truck was heading straight toward our camp. "Who the hell is that?" Jake whispered, his voice shaking. We scrambled to douse the fire and hide behind the rocks and bushes surrounding our campsite. The truck pulled up, its engine rumbling ominously. 2 men stepped out, their figures barely illuminated by the headlights. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces shadowed. "They're looking for something," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. One of the men kicked at our extinguished fire pit, while the other began inspecting our tents. My stomach churned as I realized they weren't just passing by, they were searching for us. The men spoke in low, hurried voices, their words too faint to understand. Then one of them pulled out something that made my blood run cold. Sarah's disposable camera. She must have left it in the tent. He held it up to his companion, who nodded grimly. The man shouted something in Spanish and pointed toward the direction of the cooler. They climbed back into the truck, but instead of leaving, they parked at the edge of the campsite and turned off their headlights. For hours we stayed hidden, terrified to move. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified. When dawn finally broke, the truck was gone. We thought we were safe, until we returned to our camp and found a chilling message scrawled in the dirt. "We're watching you." Panic set in. We packed our gear in record time, throwing everything into my truck and speeding off without looking back. The desert blurred past us as we raced toward the main road, desperate to put distance between us and the campsite. But about 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. The black pickup truck. It was far behind, but gaining fast. "They're following us," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I pushed the gas pedal harder, the engine roaring in protest. The truck matched our speed, closing the gap. Suddenly, it swerved into the oncoming lane and pulled up alongside us. I glanced over and saw one of the men pointing a gun at us. "Pull over," he shouted. Instead of complying, I slammed on the brakes, sending our truck skidding to a stop. The pickup sped past us but quickly turned around, its tires kicking up a cloud of dust. We veered off the road, barreling down a rocky trail that cut through the desert. The pickup followed, relentless. Our truck bounced violently over the uneven terrain, the tires struggling for traction. The men in the pickup fired a shot, the sound echoing across the desert. Sarah screamed as the back window shattered, glass raining down on us. "We can't outrun them," Jake yelled. Ahead, I spotted a narrow ravine, its entrance barely wide enough for our truck. Without thinking, I swerved into it, scraping the sides of the vehicle as we squeezed through. The pickup couldn't follow, and for a moment, it felt like we'd escaped. But the relief was short-lived. The ravine ended abruptly, forcing us to stop. We were trapped, the walls too steep to climb. The sound of the pickup's engine echoed faintly in the distance. They were circling, searching for a way in. The five of us sat in tense silence, our hearts pounding. The desert around us was deathly quiet, save for the faint growl of the engine. Every passing second felt like an eternity, and I could see the panic in Sarah's eyes. "They're not going to stop," Jake whispered, gripping a large rock like it was the only weapon he had. The truck's headlights flickered into view at the edge of the ravine, casting long shadows on the jagged walls. One of the men shouted something in Spanish, his voice carrying over the still air. We didn't understand the words, but the tone was enough to make my stomach drop. Then, out of nowhere, another set of lights appeared in the distance. This time, bright, white, and steady. A patrol car was making its way down the main dirt road we had driven earlier, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It wasn't moving fast, and from where we sat, it was clear the officers weren't responding to anything specific. It was just a routine patrol, the kind you'd expect along remote border areas. "Is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Homeland Security," Jake said, pointing to the decals faintly visible on the side of the vehicle. The men in the pickup truck must have spotted it too, because their engine roared as they sped off into the desert. Dust billowed up behind them, obscuring their taillights as they disappeared into the night. The patrol car slowed as it approached the edge of the ravine, its beams illuminating our truck. Two officers stepped out, their movements calm but cautious. They weren't expecting anything unusual, but the sight of 5 terrified campers scrambling out of a ravine with wild looks on their faces clearly caught their attention. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, his hand hovering near his holster. We all started talking at once, trying to explain what had happened, but our words were a chaotic jumble. Jake stepped forward, holding up his hands in a gesture of calm. "Some guys were following us," he said. "We didn't do anything wrong. We found something in the desert, and they came after us." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions sharpening. "What did you find?" "A cooler," I said. "It had cash, bloody clothes, and a map. We didn't take anything, we swear. But they must have thought we did." The officers asked us to show them exactly where we'd found the cooler, but none of us wanted to go back. Instead, Jake sketched out the location as best he could on a piece of paper they handed him. "You're lucky," one of the officers said, his tone grave. "These areas are known for cartel activity. If they were after you, it wasn't just about scaring you." They didn't escort us home or arrest anyone that night. Instead, they advised us to stay out of the area and promised to follow up on the location of the cooler. We drove away in silence, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. Even now, I can't forget that night. The sound of the truck circling, the feeling of being hunted, and the sight of those men disappearing into the desert. We were lucky the patrol happened to pass by when it did. If they hadn't, I don't know how the story would have ended. That trip taught me a lesson I'll never forget. The desert holds more than beauty, it holds danger. And sometimes what you stumble upon is best left untouched. Lake Texoma, straddling the border between Texas and Oklahoma, is a fisherman's paradise. In 2017, I worked as a fishing guide there, taking clients out on the lake to reel in striped bass and soak in the peaceful scenery. That summer day started like any other, with the sun rising over calm waters and the promise of a fruitful day ahead. My client that morning was a middle-aged man named David. He'd booked a full-day trip, claiming he wanted to relive childhood memories of fishing with his late father. He seemed polite but quiet, the kind of person who keeps to himself. He had brought along his own gear, which wasn't unusual, though it looked older and well-worn, like it had seen more use than its owner let on. We set off, the boat gliding over the water as the morning mist lifted. David barely spoke, his eyes fixed on the lake surface. I chalked it up to nerves. Some clients feel self-conscious around guides, but there was something about his demeanor that felt off, like he wasn't here just to fish. The morning passed uneventfully. David caught a few bass, but didn't seem particularly interested in his catches. Instead, he kept glancing toward the shoreline, his gaze lingering on the shallow waters and the dense brush beyond. It wasn't until early afternoon that things took a turn. We had drifted to a secluded part of the lake, an area I rarely visited because it wasn't known for good fishing. David insisted we stop there, claiming he wanted to try his luck. As he cast his line, I noticed he seemed tense, his movements stiff and deliberate. I busied myself checking the bait when his line went taut. "I've got something," David said, his voice flat. I turned to watch him reel it in, expecting another bass. But as the line drew closer, I realized something was wrong. The object breaching the surface wasn't a fish. It was grayish, misshapen, and covered in muck. David hesitated for a moment before yanking the line hard, pulling the object onto the boat. At first glance, I couldn't make sense of it. It looked like a chunk of bone tangled in old fishing line, but as I leaned closer, my stomach turned. It wasn't just a bone, it was part of a human skeleton. The unmistakable curve of a rib and a fragment of a vertebra sent a chill down my spine. "What the hell is this?" I muttered, my voice trembling. David didn't respond. He stared at the bone, his face expressionless. Then slowly, he picked it up and tossed it back into the water. "What are you doing?" I shouted, horrified. "That's evidence. We need to call the cops." David's eyes met mine, and for the first time all day, his calm facade cracked. There was something cold and calculating in his gaze that made my blood run cold. "You don't need to do that," he said quietly. "It's just some old trash." But I wasn't buying it. Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911, stepping to the other side of the boat to put some distance between us. As I explained the situation to the dispatcher, I could feel David's eyes boring into me. When I hung up, David forced a tight smile. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his tone eerily calm. "You're making this into something it's not." I ignored him, focusing on steering the boat back toward the marina. The tension in the air was suffocating. David didn't try to stop me, but I could feel the weight of his silence, the way he shifted in his seat as if weighing his options. The patrol boat arrived at the marina just as we docked. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions serious as I explained what had happened. David's demeanor shifted again. He became cooperative, even helpful, describing the spot where we'd found the bone fragment. But something about his performance felt rehearsed. The officers requested to search the area and asked David to remain at the marina for questioning. I stayed behind too, still shaken by the discovery. As the hours passed, the weight of what we'd uncovered began to sink in. This wasn't just a fishing trip gone wrong, it was something much darker. Later that evening, the officers returned with more bone fragments pulled from the lake bed. They confirmed they were human and suspected foul play. David, who had been sitting on a bench, stood up and claimed he needed to leave. The officers didn't let him go. As they questioned him, David's story began to unravel. His calm demeanor gave way to frustration, and eventually, he stopped answering their questions altogether. The next morning, after further investigation, authorities revealed that the remains belonged to a man who had gone missing 2 years earlier. It turned out that David wasn't just any client. He had been linked to the missing man, a former business partner with whom he'd had a falling out. The evidence mounted against him, and after days of interrogation, David finally confessed. He had killed his partner during a heated argument and used the lake to dispose of the body. The fishing trip had been a calculated move to ensure the remains were still hidden. David hadn't counted on me discovering them, nor had he anticipated law enforcement getting involved so quickly. In the end, David was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. As for me, I stopped guiding fishing trips after that. Every time I look at Lake Texoma, I can't help but think of the secrets it holds and the monster I unknowingly brought onto my boat. My name is Don. This happened to me a few years back. Working the night shift at a remote Texas gas station wasn't exactly thrilling, but it paid the bills. I spent most nights stocking shelves, mopping the floors, and occasionally serving the few travelers who stopped for gas or snacks. It was the kind of job where you could go hours without seeing anyone, leaving plenty of time for the silence to settle into your bones. That night started like any other. The moon hung low over the desolate highway, casting faint light over the empty lot. A couple of regulars stopped by around 11 p.m., buying cigarettes and coffee. After they left, it was just me and the faint hum of the gas pumps. Around midnight, I noticed a car parked at the far end of the lot. It was an older sedan, navy blue with tinted windows. At first, I thought it belonged to a customer filling up or someone taking a quick break from driving. But as the minutes turned into hours, the car didn't move. The engine wasn't running, and the headlights stayed off. A creeping unease settled over me. I kept looking out the window, half expecting the driver to come inside, but no one did. By 1:30 a.m., the car was still there, its silhouette blending into the shadows at the edge of the lot. Curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside. The cool night air hit me, and the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel seemed too loud in the stillness. As I approached the car, I could feel my heart start to race. Something about the way it just sat there, silent and unmoving, set off alarm bells in my head. I knocked on the driver's side window. "Hey, you all right in there?" I called out. No response. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside, and the silence was unnerving. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Then I heard it. A faint, muffled sound coming from the direction of the trunk. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. It was hard to tell over the faint hum of the pumps, but it sounded like someone was trying to yell, their voice stifled by something. Panic set in. I backed away from the car, my mind racing with possibilities. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I hurried back inside the store, locking the door behind me. Grabbing my phone, I called 911, my hands shaking as I explained the situation. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but I could hear the urgency in her tone as she told me officers were on their way. "Stay inside the store and don't approach the vehicle again," she said. I followed her advice, pacing nervously behind the counter while keeping one eye on the car. About 10 minutes later, I saw movement. A man stepped out of the shadows near the car. He was tall and stocky, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. My stomach dropped. He must have been hiding nearby, waiting for the right moment to make his move. The man looked toward the store, his gaze lingering on the glass doors. I ducked behind the counter, trying to stay out of sight. When I peeked again, he was at the trunk, fiddling with the lock. Just then, the sound of sirens broke the silence. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance, growing brighter as two patrol cars pulled into the lot. The man froze for a split second before slamming the trunk shut and sprinting toward the highway. The officers were out of their cars in seconds, shouting for him to stop. One of them gave chase, while the other approached the vehicle with his gun drawn. I stepped outside as the officer pried open the trunk. Inside was a young woman, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with fear. The officer quickly cut her restraints and helped her out, wrapping her in a blanket from his car. The man was caught a short distance away, tackled to the ground before he could disappear into the darkness. Later, the officers told me the man was a known criminal with a history of violent offenses. He had abducted the woman hours earlier and was waiting for the gas station to empty before transferring her to another vehicle parked nearby. My decision to call 911 had likely saved her life. Even now, years later, I can't forget the sound of her muffled cries or the look on the man's face as he realized he was caught. That night, I learned how quickly the ordinary can turn into something horrifying, and how a single decision can make all the difference.